The letter arrived at the Whitmore estate on an October morning, when the fog clung to the Connecticut hills like a burial shroud. Reverend Josiah Whitmore held the parchment with trembling fingers, his wife Prudence watching from the doorway of their modest parsonage. "What troubles you so, husband?" she asked, noting the pallor that had crept across his weathered face. Josiah's lips moved silently as he read the words again, as if repetition might change their meaning. "It's from my brother, Ezekiel. He's to be married." Prudence smiled, moving closer. "Why, that's wonderful news. Ezekiel has been alone since—" "He's marrying a Negro woman," Josiah interrupted, his voice barely a whisper. "A freed slave named Temperance." The words hung in the air between them like smoke from a funeral pyre. Prudence's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes widening with a mixture of shock and something else, something that looked almost like fear. Ezekiel Whitmore had always been the peculiar brother, the one who'd moved to Philadelphia and taken up with the abolitionists. He'd freed the 3 slaves their father had left him, scandalizing the family even in progressive Connecticut. But this was something altogether different. The wedding was to be held at the old Blackwood Church, an abandoned structure that had stood empty for 30 years, ever since Reverend Cornelius Blackwood had been found hanging from the bell rope. His neck stretched unnaturally long, his eyes still open and staring at something no one else could see. The official story was suicide, brought on by madness. But the old folks whispered other tales, tales of dark sermons and darker deeds, of prayers said backward, and books bound in leather that wasn't from any animal known to man. "He cannot be serious," Prudence whispered. "The Blackwood Church, that cursed place." Josiah read on, his frown deepening. "He says it's the only church that will host such a wedding. The regular clergy refuse. Even the Quakers have turned him away." He paused, his eyes scanning the elegant script. "He's gathering other couples, other freed Negroes, marrying into white families, 6 couples in total. He says it will be a demonstration, a statement to the nation that all men are truly equal before God." 6 couples? Prudence's voice rose with alarm. "Josiah, you cannot attend such a spectacle. Think of your position, your congregation." "He's my brother," Josiah said quietly, but his hand shook as he set the letter down on the oak table. "Blood calls to blood." That night, Josiah lay awake, listening to the wind howl through the eaves. In his dreams, he saw the Blackwood Church as it had been in his childhood, tall and imposing, its black spire reaching toward heaven like an accusing finger. He saw the bell tower swaying, though there was no wind. He saw the doors standing open, darkness pouring out like ink into water. And he saw figures in white walking toward those doors, couples hand in hand, while something watched from the shadows of the trees, something old, something patient, something that had been waiting in that church for 30 years, waiting for the right moment, the right sacrifice. When he woke, gasping, Prudence was already awake beside him. "You're going, aren't you?" she asked. Josiah nodded slowly, though every instinct screamed at him to burn the invitation and forget he'd ever received it. "Then God help us all," Prudence whispered, and pulled the covers tight around her shoulders, though the room was not cold. Outside, in the darkness before dawn, a crow called out 3 times and fell silent. The wedding was 3 weeks away. The coach rattled along the muddy road toward Philadelphia, each jolt sending tremors through Josiah's bones. Beside him, Prudence clutched her Bible, her lips moving in silent prayer. They'd been traveling for 2 days, and with each mile, Josiah felt the weight of their destination pressing down upon his chest like a gravestone. "Tell me again why I agreed to come," Prudence murmured, her face pale in the dim light filtering through the coach window. Josiah had no answer. He'd asked himself the same question 100 times since they'd departed Connecticut. But the pull had been undeniable, not brotherly love alone, but something else. Something that whispered to him in the dead of night, telling him he must be there, that this wedding was important, in ways he couldn't yet understand. They arrived in Philadelphia on a gray afternoon, the sky the color of old pewter. Ezekiel's home was a narrow brick townhouse on Society Hill, respectable enough, though the neighbors' curtains twitched as the Whitmores approached. Ezekiel answered the door himself, no servant. Josiah noted and pulled his brother into a fierce embrace. He looked older than his 32 years, his face lined with the weight of his convictions, but his eyes burned with fierce purpose. "Brother, you came. I prayed you would, despite—" He stopped, noticing Prudence. "Sister, you are most welcome." Inside they met Temperance for the first time. She was tall and dignified, her skin the color of polished mahogany, her bearing that of a queen despite the simple Quaker dress she wore. When she spoke, her voice was cultured, educated, the voice of a woman who had taught herself to read by candlelight after her day's labor was done. "Reverend Whitmore," she said, extending her hand. "Your brother has spoken of you with great affection." Josiah took her hand, feeling Prudence stiffen beside him. "Miss Temperance, I wish you joy." "It's Mrs. Freeman," she corrected gently. "I took the name when I was freed, Temperance Freeman, though soon I shall be Mrs. Whitmore, God willing." That evening, around a simple dinner table, Ezekiel introduced them to the other couples who would be wed. There was Augustus, a freed blacksmith, marrying Mercy Hawthorne, a seamstress's daughter who defied her family. There was Samuel and Constance, both former slaves, marrying the Quaker siblings Jebediah and Martha Goodwin. And there were 3 more couples, each pair representing a chasm that society said could not be bridged. As they spoke, sharing their stories of love and defiance, Josiah noticed something odd. Each person, at some point, would fall silent mid-sentence, their eyes drifting toward the window, toward the north, where the Blackwood Church waited. "Has anyone visited the church?" Josiah asked, breaking one such silence. The room grew cold, though the fire still burned bright. Ezekiel cleared his throat. "I went, 3 days ago, to ensure it was suitable." "And?" Josiah pressed. His brother's hands trembled as he reached for his wineglass. "It's intact, dusty, abandoned, but structurally sound. The locals won't go near it, of course. Superstitious nonsense about old Reverend Blackwood." "I heard singing," Temperance said suddenly, her voice quiet. Everyone turned to her. "When Ezekiel came back that night, he was asleep, but I heard him singing. Hymns I'd never heard before, in a language that wasn't English. Wasn't any language I recognized." Ezekiel's face flushed. "I don't remember that. I was exhausted from the journey." "The words were backwards," Temperance continued, her dark eyes fixed on the candle flame between them, like someone reading scripture in a mirror. Augustus, the blacksmith, set down his fork with a clatter. "My dreams," he said hoarsely. "Since we planned this, I've had dreams. About the church, about the bell tower. There's something in the bell tower." "Stop," Mercy pleaded, gripping his massive arm. "Please, Augustus." But Josiah leaned forward, his heart hammering. "What's in the bell tower?" Augustus met his eyes, and Josiah saw terror there, pure, animal terror in the eyes of a man who'd survived the horrors of slavery. "A rope," Augustus whispered. "A rope that's waiting, and at the end of it, something's tied, something that wants to hang again, all of us." The candle between them flickered and died, though there was no wind. In the darkness, someone began to weep. The next morning, Josiah woke to find Ezekiel already gone. Temperance sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had long since gone cold. "He's gone to arrange the final details," she said before Josiah could ask. "The flowers, the candles. He wants everything to be perfect." Her voice carried a hollowness that chilled him. "Temperance," Josiah sat across from her. "We could hold the ceremony elsewhere. A field, a barn, anywhere but that church." She looked up at him with eyes that held decades of suffering compressed into young features. "You think I haven't begged him? But he says it must be the Blackwood Church. He says it's the only way to make the statement mean something, to sanctify a place of darkness with an act of love and equality." She paused. Those were his exact words. Sanctify a place of darkness. As if he were reading from a script. Before Josiah could respond, a knock thundered at the door. Prudence emerged from the bedroom, her face drawn with lack of sleep. When Josiah opened the door, he found himself face to face with an ancient Negro woman, her back bent with age, her eyes milky with cataracts. "I must speak with the ones who plan to marry at Blackwood," she rasped. "I'm sorry, but—" "Let her in, Josiah." Temperance stood, recognition flickering across her face. "I know her. This is Abigail. She was there, at the church, 30 years ago." The old woman shuffled inside, leaning heavily on a twisted walking stick. When she settled into a chair, she fixed her blind gaze on each of them in turn, as if she could see straight through to their souls. "I was Reverend Blackwood's property," Abigail began, her voice like wind through dead leaves. "Me and 12 others. He preached on Sundays about salvation, but come Monday, he worked us till we bled. But that wasn't the worst of it." She paused, her gnarled fingers tracing patterns on the table patterns that made Josiah's skin crawl, symbols that seemed to writhe in the corner of his vision. "He had a book," she continued, "bound in pigskin, he told us, but we knew better. He'd read from it at night, down in the cellar beneath the church, making bargains, trading souls for power. He wanted to live forever, you see, wanted to see slavery endure for all eternity." Prudence gasped. "That's blasphemy." "Yes'm, it was. And when we rose up, when we finally couldn't bear it no more, we stopped him. 12 of us overpowered him, dragged him to the bell tower, and hung him from his own bell rope." Abigail's face twisted into something between a smile and a grimace. "But he was laughing as he died, laughing and saying words that made our ears bleed. Said he'd made a pact. Said when the time was right, when the bloodlines mixed, when black and white came together in that church willingly, he'd return." The room had grown so cold that frost formed on the windows, despite the autumn warmth outside. "6 couples," Abigail whispered. 12 souls. Same number as them that killed him. Same number as his disciples in darkness. You're completing the ritual he started. You're giving him exactly what he needs." Temperance stood abruptly, her chair clattering backward. No, Ezekiel would never. He doesn't know about this." "Don't he?" Abigail's blind eyes seemed to bore into her. "You said yourself, child. He speaks backwards words in his sleep. He says things like they're from a script. You think that's your Ezekiel talking? Or something that's been whispering to him, using his good heart against him?" Josiah felt his world tilting. His brother, possessed, manipulated by some dark force that had waited 30 years for this moment? "We have to stop the wedding," he said firmly. But even as the words left his mouth, he heard the front door open. Ezekiel stood in the doorway, his arms full of white roses, flowers that released a sickly sweet perfume that smelled of rot beneath the beauty. "Stop the wedding?" Ezekiel's voice was his own, but something flickered behind his eyes, something ancient and hungry. "Why, brother, we've only just begun." Behind him, in the bright morning sun, Josiah could see the shadows moving wrong, bending toward his brother like subjects before a king. Abigail struggled to her feet, pointing her stick at Ezekiel. "The Reverend's mark! He bears the Reverend's mark!" And there, just visible above Ezekiel's collar, was a symbol burned into his skin, a brand in the shape of a noose, still smoking as if freshly made. Ezekiel's smile widened unnaturally, stretching his face until Josiah thought the skin might tear. Then, just as suddenly, his brother blinked and stumbled, the roses tumbling from his arms. What happened?" Ezekiel touched his neck, wincing at the burn. When his fingers came away, They were smeared with ash. I was at the flower merchant's, and then, I don't remember walking home. Temperance rushed to him, but Abigail thrust out her walking stick, blocking her path. "Don't touch him when the mark is fresh," the old woman warned. "It's a doorway. Blackwood can step through whenever he pleases now." Prudence had backed against the wall, her Bible clutched to her chest. "This is madness. Josiah, we must leave. Now." But Josiah found himself frozen, watching his brother's confusion turn to horror as he caught his reflection in the darkened window. The mark on his neck pulsed with a faint, sickly light. "How long?" Ezekiel's voice broke. "How long has he been inside me?" Abigail lowered herself back into her chair with a heavy sigh. "Since you first entered that church, I reckon. The moment you crossed the threshold, you invited him in. Blackwood's been dead 30 years, but his will is strong. He's been waiting, building his strength in the spaces between the living and the dead." Augustus appeared in the doorway, Mercy close behind him. They'd heard the commotion from the boarding house next door where they were staying. "What's happening here?" "Show them," Abigail commanded, pointing at Ezekiel's neck. When Augustus saw the mark, his face went gray. "I've seen that symbol before. In my dreams. It's on all of us, isn't it?" As if answering his question, Mercy gasped and pulled down the collar of her dress. There, on her shoulder, was the same smoking brand. Augustus tore open his shirt. The noose mark sat directly over his heart. One by one, the other couples arrived, drawn by some invisible summons, and each bore the mark somewhere on their body. 12 souls, Josiah breathed. "He's marked all 12 of you." Samuel, a quiet man who'd barely spoken during dinner, sank to his knees. "I felt it, 3 nights ago, like ice water being poured into my veins while I slept. I thought it was just fear of the wedding, fear of what we were doing." His voice rose to a wail. "What have we done? What have we agreed to?" Constance, his bride-to-be, wrapped her arms around him. "We agreed to love. We agreed to stand against injustice. That's all we agreed to." "No," Abigail shook her head. "You agreed to marry at Blackwood Church, and in doing so, you completed a contract written in blood 30 years ago. Reverend Blackwood needed willing participants' souls given freely in a sacred ceremony, slaves he could take by force, but this ritual required choice, required love." She spat the last word like a curse. He knew abolitionists would come eventually, knew that freed slaves and progressive whites would seek to marry. He just had to wait for the right moment, the right number. Jebediah Goodwin, the Quaker, stepped forward. "Then we simply won't go. We'll refuse to attend the ceremony." But even as he spoke, his sister Martha began to walk toward the door, her movements jerky and unnatural, like a marionette on strings. "Martha!" Jebediah grabbed her arm, but she turned to him with eyes that had rolled back to whites. "The church calls," she said in a voice that echoed with the rasp of rope on wood. "The hour approaches. The covenant must be fulfilled." Her head tilted at an impossible angle. "Come, come, little ones. Come to your wedding. Come to your sacrifice. Come to your eternity in service of the true Reverend." Temperance screamed. The sound broke whatever force held Martha, and she collapsed into her brother's arms, gasping and weeping. Ezekiel stood suddenly, his face set with grim determination, despite the fear in his eyes. "There has to be a way to break this. Abigail, you survived. You escaped him. How?" The old woman's face crumpled with ancient grief. "I didn't escape, child. None of us did. Them that helped hang Blackwood, all 12 died within the year. Accidents, they said. A fall from a ladder, drowned in a well, trampled by horses, but I saw their faces before they died. I saw the noose marks glowing on their skin, tightening like real rope, choking the life from them wherever they went." She looked at each of the marked couples with her blind, knowing eyes. "He took 12 souls 30 years ago, and now he means to take 12 more. Only this time, he won't just kill you. This time, you'll be his congregation for all eternity, bound to that church, bound to him, spreading his darkness through every bloodline you create, black and white together, just as he planned. A twisted mockery of the very equality you sought to celebrate. Outside, though it was mid-morning, the sky had darkened to the color of a bruise, and from somewhere to the north a church bell began to toll. The sound of the bell rippled through the room like a physical force. Each toll seemed to grip the marked couples, pulling them forward as if invisible chains had been looped around their necks. "Fight it!" Josiah shouted, grabbing Ezekiel as his brother lurched toward the door. But Ezekiel's strength was inhuman, fueled by something far beyond mortal muscle. He threw Josiah aside as easily as swatting a fly. "Must go," Temperance whispered, her feet dragging across the floor toward the exit. "The bell. It's calling us home." Augustus fell to his knees, his massive blacksmith's hands clawing at the floorboards, trying to anchor himself. Mercy stumbled past him, her eyes glazed, moving in perfect rhythm with the bell's toll. One by one, the couples began shuffling toward the door like sleepwalkers, their faces blank masks of compulsion. "The wedding is today," Prudence cried out, checking the calendar on the wall. "But it was supposed to be 3 days from now, October 28th. Abigail's laugh was bitter as ashes. "Blackwood chooses the day, not your brother. Today is the anniversary, 30 years to the day since we hung him. He's been counting every hour, every minute, waiting for this moment." Josiah watched in horror as the marked couples filed out into the street. Neighbors peered from behind curtains, crossing themselves, as the strange procession began moving north through Philadelphia. The 12 walked in pairs, hand in hand like true wedding couples, but their faces were empty, their movements synchronized to the distant bell that never stopped tolling. "We have to follow them," Josiah said, though every instinct screamed at him to run the opposite direction. "No," Abigail struggled to stand. "You have to stop them, and there's only one way." She reached into her tattered shawl and pulled out a small leather pouch, blackened with age. "Blackwood's book. After he died, I took it from the cellar, kept it hidden all these years, afraid to destroy it, afraid of what might happen if I did." She pressed the pouch into Josiah's hands. Inside, he could feel the book small, no larger than his palm, but heavy with a weight that had nothing to do with physical mass. Even through the leather, it felt warm, almost alive. "There's a counter-ritual," Abigail whispered urgently. "On the last page, written in his own blood. He wrote it as insurance, in case his servants ever turned against him. It requires a sacrifice, a life freely given by one not marked, one with no tie to the covenant." Josiah's blood ran cold. "You mean?" "A volunteer must die in the church before the ceremony completes," Abigail confirmed. "Must die willingly, speaking the words from that page, while the marked ones still have a thread of their own will remaining. It will break the covenant, but it will also destroy whoever speaks the words." Prudence grabbed Josiah's arm. "No, there must be another way." "There isn't." Abigail's blind eyes wept black tears. "I've spent 30 years searching. I've consulted every wise woman, every root worker, every priest who would listen. This is the only way. One pure soul to counter 12 corrupted ones." Through the window, they could see the procession had already reached the edge of the city. The 12 moved with increasing speed, drawn by the bell's relentless tolling. Above them, birds fell from the sky, dead before they hit the ground. Josiah clutched the pouch, feeling its awful heat. "How long do we have?" "Sundown," Abigail said. "When true darkness falls, Blackwood will emerge fully. He'll conduct the ceremony himself, and when those vows are spoken, when those couples are bound in unholy matrimony, their souls will be sealed to him forever. And worse, any children born of those unions will carry his mark, his corruption spreading through generations." "Then I'll do it," Josiah said quietly. "I'll speak the words." "No!" Prudence's scream was anguished. "Josiah, please!" "He's my brother," Josiah said. The same words he'd spoken when the invitation arrived. But now they carried the weight of finality. Blood calls to blood. Abigail gripped his hand with surprising strength. You must wait for the right moment. The ceremony has 3 parts: the gathering, the binding, and the consummation. You must act during the binding, when the couples join hands before the altar. Too soon, and the marks will remain. Too late, and the ritual completes. You'll have mere seconds. Josiah nodded, slipping the pouch into his coat pocket. Then we'd better hurry. We need to reach the church before they do. But Abigail shook her head grimly. You won't. The bell pulls them fast, faster than any horse can run. They'll be there within the hour, and the sun sets 3 hours after that. You'll arrive to find them already assembled, already beginning. She pulled a small vial from her shawl, the last item she carried. Holy water, blessed by a true believer 50 years ago, before corruption took root in these lands. Anoint yourself with it before you enter the church. It won't protect you, but it will let you move freely while others are frozen by Blackwood's power. Josiah took the vial, its glass cold against his palm, a stark contrast to the burning book in his pocket. Prudence buried her face in his chest, her body shaking with sobs. I can't lose you. Not like this. You won't, he lied gently, holding her tight. God will protect the righteous. But as they prepared to leave, as they gathered what little they would need for the journey to Blackwood Church, Josiah caught his reflection in the window. And for just a moment, he could swear he saw a noose's shadow falling across his own neck. The hired coach driver refused to take them all the way to Blackwood Church. He left them a mile down the road, crossing himself repeatedly and urging his horses away at a frantic gallop. Josiah, Prudence, and Abigail, who had insisted on coming despite her age, walked the remaining distance as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. The church rose before them like a rotted tooth against the darkening sky. Its black spire pierced the clouds, and the bell in the tower swung without ceasing, though no human hand pulled the rope. The sound was deafening now, each toll reverberating through Josiah's chest, shaking his very bones. The 12 marked souls stood in the churchyard, arranged in perfect pairs before the entrance. They were motionless as statues, their eyes fixed on the sealed doors. Someone or something had dressed them in wedding attire. The men wore black suits that seemed to absorb light, while the women wore white dresses that glowed with an unnatural luminescence. Ezekiel, Josiah called out, but his brother didn't move, didn't blink. They're locked in the gathering phase, Abigail explained, her voice barely audible over the bell. Frozen until he's ready for them. As if summoned by her words, the church doors groaned open. No one stood behind them, only darkness, thick and viscous as tar, poured out across the threshold. And within that darkness, something moved. Reverend Cornelius Blackwood stepped into the fading daylight. He was not as Josiah had imagined. The corpse that emerged was pristine, untouched by 3 decades in the grave. He stood tall and thin, dressed in immaculate clerical robes, his face handsome in a cruel, angular way. Only his neck betrayed his nature stretched impossibly long, the flesh purple and bruised where the rope had been, the noose mark still visible as a black ring around his throat. When he smiled, his teeth were too white, too many, arranged in rows like a shark's. Welcome, Blackwood's voice echoed from everywhere and nowhere, resonating in the bones of the earth itself. Welcome to my congregation. I have waited so long for this blessed day. The 12 couples began to move, walking in synchronized steps toward the church entrance. Josiah tried to run forward, but Prudence held him back. Not yet, she hissed. Abigail said during the binding, not before. They watched helplessly as the couples filed into the church, disappearing into that terrible darkness. Blackwood's eyes filmed over with the white of death swept across the churchyard and fixed on Josiah. Ah, and uninvited guests. How delightful. His neck twisted, rotating his head completely around before snapping back to face forward. The brother. I remember you from Ezekiel's memories. Such concern, such devotion. But you're too late, Reverend Whitmore. The covenant is nearly complete. I won't let you have them, Josiah said, his hand clutching the leather pouch in his pocket. Blackwood laughed, and the sound was like wind through a graveyard. Let me? Child, they came willingly. That's the beauty of my design. I offered no false promises, no deception. They wanted to marry, to unite black and white in defiance of man's law. I simply provided the venue. Their own noble intentions sealed their fate. He turned and glided back into the church, his elongated neck swaying like a serpent. Come, come, all are welcome to witness the ceremony, even those who would stand against me. After all, his laughter echoed back to them. What harm can three mortals do against a force that has been building for 30 years? Josiah uncorked the vial of holy water with trembling fingers. He poured it over his head, feeling it burn like liquid ice as it ran down his face and neck. Prudence gasped where the water touched his skin. Faint symbols appeared, glowing softly in the gathering dusk. Ancient words of protection, inscribed by faith alone. I'm going in, he said. Then I'm coming with you, Prudence replied, snatching the vial and anointing herself before Josiah could stop her. The same symbols appeared on her skin, fainter but present. Abigail remained outside, planting her walking stick in the earth. I'll keep watch. When you speak the words, this whole church may come down. I'll bear witness to what happens here, one way or another. Josiah pulled out Blackwood's book, its leather cover writhing under his touch as if alive. He opened to the last page, and there, written in brown letters that could only be dried blood, was the counter-ritual. The words made his eyes water to look at them, written in Latin and older tongues, spiraling around a diagram of a man hanging upside down. When the moment comes, he whispered to Prudence, run, don't look back. She gripped his hand tightly. Where you go, I go. That's what marriage means. Together, they stepped across the threshold into Blackwood Church. The darkness swallowed them whole. Inside, the church was vast, impossibly larger than its exterior suggested. Pews stretched into infinity, and floating candles illuminated the scene with sickly green light. At the altar stood the 12 couples, arranged in a circle, their hands already beginning to join together. Blackwood stood at the center, his arms raised, his too long neck swaying as he began to chant in that backwards language Temperance had described. The binding phase had begun. Josiah felt the book burning in his hands, eager to be read, eager to complete its purpose. He opened his mouth to speak the words, but then he saw them. Hanging from the rafters, 12 corpses swayed in rhythm with Blackwood's chant. The original victims, still bound by ethereal ropes, their ghostly forms trapped for 30 years. Their mouths moved, screaming warnings that made no sound. And beneath them, carved into the floor in letters of fire, was a truth that made Josiah's blood freeze. The sacrifice must be pure. The sacrifice must be willing. The sacrifice must be innocent. Josiah looked down at his hands, hands that had married couples, baptized children, buried the dead, hands that were not innocent. The counter-ritual required a sacrifice he could not provide. And Blackwood, seeing his realization, smiled with all those terrible teeth. Did you truly think, Blackwood's voice slithered through the air, that a man of the cloth could be innocent? You who have judged sinners, collected tithes from the poor, turned away the desperate when they came to your door at inconvenient hours? His neck coiled like a rope preparing to hang. No, Reverend Whitmore, your hands are as stained as any man's who has lived past childhood. Josiah felt the book growing heavier, burning hotter, rejecting him. The words on the page began to fade, as if recognizing an unworthy reader. The 12 couples continued their slow dance, their hands weaving together in intricate patterns, binding themselves to Blackwood and to each other. Ezekiel's face remained blank, but tears streamed down his cheeks, some part of him still trapped inside, watching helplessly. "Then take me instead." Prudence's voice cut through the chanting. She stepped forward, her head held high despite the terror in her eyes. Blackwood's attention snapped to her, his head rotating unnaturally. "You? A wife? A woman who has lied to spare feelings? Who has felt envy and pride?" He laughed. "You are no more innocent than your husband." "Not me," Prudence said quietly. She placed her hand on her stomach, and Josiah's world stopped. "The child I carry, 3 weeks conceived, pure, innocent, untouched by sin." "No." Josiah grabbed her arm, but she pulled away gently. "I suspected before we left Connecticut," she whispered, her eyes meeting his. "I was going to tell you after the wedding, during our journey home. I imagined how happy you'd be." A tear traced down her cheek. "But God has given us this child for a purpose, Josiah. Not for our joy, but for their salvation." She took the book from his trembling hands. Blackwood's smile faltered for the first time. "You would sacrifice your own unborn child? That's monstrous." "No more monstrous than what you've done," Prudence replied, her voice steady now, filled with a calm certainty that radiated like light. "You've perverted love into chains, twisted equality into bondage, corrupted hope into despair. This child, our child, will never draw breath in a world you've poisoned. Better to die pure and save 12 souls than live in your shadow." The book in her hands began to glow, accepting her. The words on the final page blazed with golden light, readable now, eager to be spoken. "Prudence, please," Josiah begged, falling to his knees. "There must be another way." She knelt beside him, touching his face with infinite tenderness. "This is why I came with you. I knew somehow that this would be asked of me, of us." She kissed his forehead. "Raise them well, husband. Tell them what we did here. Tell them their sacrifice meant something." "Them?" Josiah's breath caught. Prudence smiled through her tears. "Twins. I saw them in a dream last night. A boy and a girl. But they were never meant for this world, Josiah. They were meant for this moment." She stood and walked toward the altar, stepping between the binding couples. Blackwood tried to move, tried to stop her, but the holy water's protection still held, creating a barrier he could not cross. "You cannot do this," Blackwood shrieked, his composure shattering. "I have waited. I have planned. This is my covenant." "No." Prudence opened the book, her voice beginning to read the counter-ritual. "This is God's covenant, and it is written in the blood of the innocent." The Latin words poured from her mouth like pure water washing away corruption. The church began to shake. The 12 couples screamed as the marks on their bodies started to burn away, smoke rising from their flesh. The ghostly corpses hanging from the rafters began to dissolve, finally freed from their 30-year torment. Blackwood lunged for Prudence, his neck stretching across the impossible distance, his jaws unhinging to reveal that nightmare maw of too many teeth. But Prudence spoke the final word. Light erupted from her body, pure and blinding. The book in her hands ignited, but the flames were white, holy, consuming the dark magic that had bound it. The light spread outward in waves, burning through the church, incinerating the shadows, destroying every trace of Blackwood's corruption. Josiah watched, screaming, as his wife became translucent, her form dissolving into that terrible, beautiful light. For one moment, he saw them 2 small spirits cradled in her arms, glowing brighter than stars. The twins who would never be born, who had existed for this purpose alone. Prudence looked at him one final time, her lips forming words he couldn't hear over the roar of destruction. But he knew what she said. "I love you." Then she was gone. The book was gone. The light consumed everything. Blackwood shrieked as the flames engulfed him, his elongated neck thrashing like a serpent in fire. His body blackened, crumbled, turned to ash that the holy fire scattered to nothingness. His final scream echoed through dimensions. "This isn't over. I'll return. I'll—" Silence. The church groaned as its foundations cracked. The ceiling began to collapse, the walls crumbling inward. Josiah felt hands grabbing him. Ezekiel, fully himself again, his eyes clear. "Brother, we have to run." The 12 couples, freed from their compulsion, raced for the doors. Behind them, Blackwood Church folded in on itself, imploding as if the earth was swallowing it whole, erasing all evidence of the evil it had housed. They burst out into the twilight, Abigail pulling them away from the collapsing structure. The ground shook violently, then fell still. Where Blackwood Church had stood, there was now only a crater, filled with ash that glowed faintly in the dying light. Josiah collapsed to his knees at the edge, staring at the ruins, at the place where his wife and unborn children had ceased to exist. The 12 survivors gathered around him in silence, alive because of a sacrifice none of them could have asked for. And in the distance, the sun set on October 28th, 1804, marking the end of Reverend Blackwood's dark covenant. But for Josiah Whitmore, it marked only the beginning of a grief that would last a lifetime. 20 years later, October 28th, 1824. The memorial stood at the edge of the crater, where Blackwood Church had once festered. It was a simple stone marker, engraved with words that Josiah had chosen with infinite care. Here fell Prudence Whitmore and her unborn children, who gave everything so that love might triumph over darkness. Let all who pass remember, the greatest sacrifice is made not in hatred, but in hope. Josiah knelt before it, his hair now more gray than brown, his face carved with lines of sorrow that 20 years had failed to soften. Around him stood the 12, those who had been saved that terrible night. Ezekiel and Temperance Whitmore had married quietly 2 months after the destruction of the church, in a simple ceremony in a Philadelphia parlor. They now had 5 children, each one a testament to the future. Prudence had died to protect. The oldest, a daughter, bore her name. Augustus and Mercy had settled in New York, where Augustus's smithy had become renowned throughout the city. They had used their prosperity to purchase the freedom of 37 souls still in bondage. Samuel and Constance, Jebediah and Martha, and the others all had built lives, raised families, created the very thing Blackwood had sought to corrupt. Genuine unions of love that transcended the artificial boundaries of race and servitude. "She should have lived to see this," Ezekiel said quietly, standing beside his brother. His hand rested on the shoulder of young Prudence, age 19, who had insisted on attending this anniversary remembrance. "She does see it," Josiah replied, his voice rough with emotion. "I have to believe that." Old Abigail had passed 5 years prior, but before her death, she had told Josiah something that he carried like a talisman against his grief. "I saw her, in my dreams," the old woman had whispered from her deathbed. "Your Prudence." She was holding 2 children, beautiful children, and she was smiling. She said to tell you, it was worth it. Every moment of it was worth it. Young Prudence knelt beside her uncle, placing fresh flowers on the memorial. "Uncle Josiah, Mother told me that you still preach, even now, that you travel from town to town, telling people what happened here." Josiah nodded. "Someone must bear witness. Someone must ensure that your aunt's sacrifice, that those unborn souls, are not forgotten." He looked out across the crater. Where nothing had grown in 20 years, the earth itself still bore the scars of what had transpired. And I must warn others. Blackwood was not the only evil man who made dark bargains. There are other churches, other places where corruption has taken root. "Do you think he could return?" Augustus asked, his voice still haunted by the memory of that night. His last words. "No," Josiah said firmly. "The sacrifice was complete. The covenant was broken. Prudence saw to that." He paused, then added more quietly, "But evil itself never truly dies. It simply finds new vessels, new methods. We must remain vigilant. As twilight descended that same hour when Prudence had spoken the final word, something remarkable happened. The crater began to glow with a soft, golden light. Not the sickly green of Blackwood's magic, but something warm and pure. The 12 and their families stepped closer, watching in awe as shapes formed in the light. Transparent figures, barely visible, but unmistakably there. Prudence stood at the center, radiant and whole, her arms around two luminous children, a boy and a girl, eternal in their innocence. Around her stood the 12 original victims, finally at peace, their chains broken, their long torment ended. And behind them, countless other spirits, slaves who had suffered under Blackwood's cruelty, victims of his dark experiments, souls he had consumed in his quest for immortal power. All of them free now, all of them whole. Prudence looked directly at Josiah, and though no words were spoken, he felt her message in his heart. Live. Love. Continue the work we began. Make the sacrifice mean something. The vision lasted only moments before fading, leaving behind a changed landscape. Where the crater had been barren and dead for 20 years, a single flower had bloomed a white rose, pristine and perfect, growing from impossible soil. Young Prudence plucked it carefully and handed it to Josiah. For remembrance, she said. As the families departed, walking back toward the town where they would share a meal and swap stories of their children and their triumphs, Josiah remained behind for a moment longer. He pressed the rose to his lips, then placed it on the memorial. I kept my promise, my love, he whispered to the gathering darkness. I told them about the sacrifice. I've spent 20 years ensuring the world knows what you did, what our children did, and I'll spend whatever time I have left doing the same. A breeze stirred, carrying the faint scent of flowers and something else, something like Prudence's lavender perfume, the one she'd worn on their wedding day. Josiah smiled through his tears, the first genuine smile that had touched his face in 2 decades. The work was not finished. It would never be finished. As long as hatred existed, as long as people sought to enslave and corrupt and destroy, there would be need for those who remembered, those who stood against the darkness. But tonight, on this anniversary of horror and hope, Josiah Whitmore allowed himself to believe that his wife was at peace, that his children, the twins who had never drawn breath but had saved 12 souls, were safe in whatever realm awaited the truly innocent. And as he walked away from the memorial, the white rose glowed faintly in the moonlight, a beacon marking the spot where love had triumphed over darkness, where sacrifice had shattered evil, where a mother's devotion had rewritten destiny itself. Behind him, if he had looked back, he would have seen words forming in the ash of the crater, written by an unseen hand. They will be remembered, always. And in a world still struggling with the chains of slavery, still fighting for the equality that 12 couples had nearly died to celebrate, that remembrance was perhaps the greatest victory of all. The end.